They were 73 and 71, sitting in plastic chairs that smelled like disinfectant and disappointment, waiting for their number to be called at the county assistant's office in Beckley, West Virginia. Thomas Brennan's hands trembled in his lap. Not from cold, though the building was cold, but from the stroke that had stolen the steadiness he'd relied on for 52 years of fixing other people's engines. His wife Margaret sat beside him, her fingers interlaced the way she'd once taught 4 children to fold their hands before supper, back when there was a table, back when there were children who still came to sit at it. They had $17 in their checking account. They had each other. And somewhere in Montana, a dead man had left them a key that would unlock something worth $265 million, though they didn't know that yet. Nobody knew. People in that waiting room glanced at them the way people glance at old furniture left on a curb, with mild pity and the quiet relief that it wasn't them. But what none of them knew, what Thomas and Margaret themselves couldn't have imagined, was that within 6 weeks, these two forgotten people would be standing in an underground vault, holding a leather journal that would rewrite the entire story of their lives. Before we go any further, if stories about real people finding hope in impossible places mean something to you, take a moment and subscribe. We have something truly special coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. The fluorescent lights above Margaret's head buzzed with a sound she'd come to know too well. Every second Tuesday for the past 4 months, she'd sat in the same row, third chair from the left, close enough to the counter to hear when her number was called, but far enough from the door to avoid the draft that crept in every time someone entered. She knew the pattern of cracks in the linoleum. She knew which ceiling tiles had water stains shaped like states she'd never visit. She knew the receptionist's name was Brenda, and that Brenda took her lunch at 11:45 and returned at 12:20 smelling like menthol cigarettes and the hand lotion she used to cover them. This was what her life had become. A catalogue of small observations in small rooms waiting for decisions made by people who didn't know her name. Beside her, Thomas stared at the floor. His shoulders curved inward not from age alone, but from the particular posture of a man trying to occupy less space in a world that had already decided he took up too much. 3 years ago, those shoulders had been broad enough to lean an engine block against. 3 years ago, his hands had known every bolt and gasket in a Chevy 350 by touch alone the way a pianist knows keys. Now those hands shook when he lifted a coffee cup, and the only engine he heard was the one inside his own chest ticking unevenly, reminding him that machines wear out whether you want them to or not. Their number was B47. The digital sign above the counter read B31. Margaret could feel the weight of the room pressing against her temples. Not just the room itself, but what it represented. 40 years of work, 37 years as a nurse's aide at Raleigh General Hospital, double shifts on holidays, weekends that bled into Mondays without a seam. She'd held dying men's hands at 3 in the morning. She'd changed sheets soaked with things she'd trained herself not to think about during meals. She'd come home smelling like bleach and exhaustion, and she'd still made dinner. Still checked homework, still kissed 4 foreheads before turning off the lights. Thomas had worked just as hard. Brennan's Auto Repair on Kanawha Street, a 2-bay shop he'd built from a bankrupt gas station when he was 26. For decades, that shop had been the heartbeat of their finances. Steady, reliable enough. Never more than enough, but always enough. He'd come home every evening with grease under his nails, so deep it never fully washed out. And Margaret had loved those hands, loved what they meant, loved that they never stopped working. They'd paid off their house by 60, a 2-bedroom ranch on Maple Ridge Road with an oak tree in the front yard that Thomas had planted the year Rachel was born. Margaret had kept a vegetable garden along the south fence, tomatoes and peppers and zucchini that she'd can every August, rows of mason jars lined up in the pantry, like small soldiers standing guard against winter. They'd never been rich, but they'd been proud. They'd been enough, until they weren't. The trouble arrived the way most trouble does, dressed as love. Thomas had his stroke on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3 years before this waiting room. He was underneath a Ford F150 replacing a transmission mount when his left hand went numb, then his left leg, Then the world tilted sideways and the concrete floor rushed up to meet his cheek. The doctors at the hospital, Margaret's old hospital, said it wasn't catastrophic. A minor ischemic event, they called it, which was a clean way of saying that a small part of Thomas Brennan had died while the rest of him kept living. His hands shook now, not much but enough. Enough to make a wrench unreliable. Enough to make customers nervous. Enough to close a shop that had been open for 47 years. Rachel called first. Their eldest, 49, living in Charleston with a husband who sold insurance and a house with granite countertops that Margaret had admired exactly once before learning what they cost. Rachel's voice on the phone had been warm, concerned, the voice of the little girl who'd once sat on Thomas's shoulders pointing at clouds and naming them. "Come stay with us just for a little while, until Dad gets his strength back. We have the room. It's the right thing to do." It sounded so reasonable, so loving. They sold the house, the oak tree, the garden, the pantry with its mason jars, the bedroom where 4 children had been conceived and 2 grandparents had grown old together. The market was good, Rachel said. They could put the money aside, maybe help with expenses, maybe leave something for the grandchildren someday. $137,000. That's what 52 years of marriage and a lifetime of mortgage payments had distilled down to. A number on a cashier's check that Thomas held in his trembling hands like a birth certificate for the rest of their lives. The money lasted 6 months. It disappeared, the way water disappears into sand quickly once the surface breaks. Rachel's husband lost his job, she said, standing in the kitchen of the house with the granite countertops that suddenly seemed less impressive. They were behind on the mortgage. Could her parents help just this once, $12,000? Then Kyle called. Their second child, 46, who'd inherited Thomas's build, but not his work ethic. Kyle needed bail money after a DUI. $5,000 he swore he'd pay it back within the month. Thomas drove to the Western Union in Rachel's car because Kyle's license had been suspended. He stood at the counter and filled out the form with shaking hands and wired the money to a son who never paid back a dime. Then Emma, 43, the quiet one, the one who sang in the church choir with a voice that made Margaret cry every Easter. Emma had medical bills from a surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. She called Margaret directly, and she cried, and Margaret's heart broke the way it always broke when her children were in pain. $8,000 sent the next morning, and Michael, their youngest, 39, the baby of the family, the one who'd brought Margaret fistfuls of dandelions and called them roses. Michael's business was failing. He needed capital. 20,000 would save everything, he said, and his voice carried the particular desperation of a man who'd already spent money he didn't have. Could they help? Please. They gave and gave and gave because that's what parents do, because the alternative was to say no to their own children, and neither Thomas nor Margaret knew how to do that. They'd never practiced. They'd never needed to. Until the bank account showed $217.33, and the phone calls stopped coming, unless they were asking for more, and the invitations to Sunday dinner dried up like creeks in August, and the grandchildren stopped remembering their names. And then Rachel's voice changed. The warmth drained out of it like heat from a house when the furnace dies. "We can't keep supporting you. You need to find your own place." Her own place. As if Margaret hadn't raised her in a home filled with the smell of bread baking and laundry hung in the sun. As if Thomas hadn't taught her to ride a bicycle on Maple Ridge Road running alongside her, with his hand on the seat, until she found her balance and didn't need him anymore. Kyle stopped answering his phone entirely. Emma sent a text that read, "Sorry, things are just really tight right now," followed by silence so complete it had a sound of its own. And Michael, sweet Michael, who used to pick dandelions and call them roses, sent a single line, "Whatever, just don't expect me to bail you out when you're homeless again." Thomas deleted the message. He sat on the edge of Rachel's guest bed, the one with sheets that smelled like fabric softener instead of love, and his shoulders shook. Margaret sat beside him, and held him the way she'd held him 1,000 times across 52 years, through job losses and funerals, and the small daily griefs that accumulate like snow on a roof until the whole structure groans. "Let them go," she whispered into his hair. "We've already lost them. This is for us now." They found the apartment above the Golden Dragon restaurant on Elmhurst Avenue. And if that sounds like the beginning of something, it wasn't. It was the end of everything they'd been. One room that smelled permanently of grease and soy sauce, and the particular sadness of people living in spaces designed for storage. The heat worked when it felt like it. The shower pressure was so weak it took 15 minutes to rinse shampoo from Margaret's thinning hair. The walls were thin enough to hear the cooks arguing downstairs in a language they didn't understand. And sometimes at night when the restaurant closed and the building settled into its own exhaustion, Margaret could hear mice moving inside the walls, like small secrets looking for a way out. Thomas's social security check was $1,236 a month. Margaret's part-time hours at the Save Mart on Route 19 when they gave her hours covered food. Some weeks there were hours. Some weeks there weren't. They applied for assistance. Housing, food stamps, anything that might ease the weight that pressed down on their chests every morning when they woke up and remembered. But the system moved slowly, and they were just two more old people in a world that had run out of patience for age. B47. The sign finally changed, and Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting the way they'd protested every morning for the past decade, cartilage worn thin from 37 years on hospital floors. She helped Thomas to his feet, feeling how much thinner he'd gotten, how the bones of his wrist pressed against her palm like a question she didn't want to answer. They walked to the counter together, the way they'd walked through everything together, one step at a time, never letting go. The social worker was a young woman named Tiffany, with kind eyes and a name tag that hung slightly crooked. She smiled the smile of someone who delivered bad news so often it had become a reflex. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brennan, you're still on the waiting list for senior housing. It could be another 6 to 8 months before something opens up." Margaret nodded. She'd expected this. She'd stopped expecting good news the way you stop expecting rain in a drought, not because you don't want it, but because wanting hurts more than going without. "Thank you for checking. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" The question was sincere. Margaret could hear that. But she could also hear the exhaustion underneath the sound of a woman who asked that question 100 times a day and rarely had a good answer to follow it. Margaret shook her head, but Thomas spoke. His voice came out gravelly and soft, roughened by years of not being heard. "We're doing okay. We've had worse." The words weren't true. They both knew it. But Thomas had always been proud, and pride was the last thing left that nobody had taken from him yet. They thanked Tiffany and walked out into the grey October afternoon. The sky hung low and swollen with clouds that promised rain, but never quite delivered the way promises had been coming to them for 3 years now. The air tasted like exhaust and fallen leaves, and the particular metallic tang of a West Virginia autumn turning cold. They walked slowly toward the bus stop, neither of them speaking. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said 1,000 times in the dark of their apartment, while the restaurant below them closed and the mice moved through the walls. When they reached their building, a 3-story brick structure, with mortar crumbling like old bread and windows that rattled when trucks passed, there was an envelope taped to the door. Margaret's hand stopped midair. The envelope was cream-colored. Thick paper stock, the kind that costs money. Their names were written across the front in elegant script that looked like it had been formed by a fountain pen, each letter deliberate, unhurried, as if the person writing had all the time in the world and wanted Thomas and Margaret to know it. Her heart clenched. Another bill, probably. Another piece of paper telling them they weren't enough, weren't eligible, weren't worth the ink it took to print a rejection. She peeled the envelope from the door carefully, the way you handle something that might hurt you. Thomas watched silently. They climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, past the door that always smelled like boiled cabbage. past the apartment where someone was always playing gospel music, just loud enough to seep through the walls like a prayer that couldn't find its way to heaven. Inside their apartment, Margaret set her purse on the small table that served as dining room desk, and the place where all their remaining hopes fit into a space the size of a placemat. She turned on the lamp with the crooked shade. Thomas sat on the edge of their bed, the mattress sagging under his weight like a sigh. She opened the envelope carefully, sliding her finger under the flap. Inside was a letter on letterhead so crisp it crinkled when she unfolded it. The logo at the top read, Finch and Associates Attorneys at Law, Helena, Montana. She read it once silently, her lips moving the way they did when she prayed. Then again. Then a third time, because surely the words had rearranged themselves between readings. Surely she'd misunderstood. Surely this was meant for someone else, someone who still had the right to receive good news. She handed it to Thomas without speaking. If she spoke, it might disappear. He held the letter close, squinting. His reading glasses had broken 2 months ago, snapped at the bridge when he'd rolled over on them in the night. They couldn't afford to replace them. He read aloud slowly, the way a man reads something he doesn't trust. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, we are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiaries in the estate of Elias James Brennan, your late cousin. Mr. Brennan passed away 6 months ago at the age of 89. His estate includes a log cabin on 43 acres of forested land in Jefferson County, Montana. There are no debts, liens, or encumbrances. The property is free and clear. Thomas looked up. His eyes were wet and the letter trembled in his hands. Elias. Margaret's throat tightened around the name. I only met him twice. Once at your mother's funeral in 1991. He stood in the back and didn't talk to anyone. And once at that reunion in Oregon, 1987. He was the quiet one, the one who lived out west somewhere and never married. She paused. I don't think I said more than 10 words to him in my life. Thomas turned the letter over as if the back might contain an explanation. Why would he leave us anything we barely knew him? From below, the sounds of the restaurant rose through the floorboards. Clanging pots, raised voices, the hiss of something heating hot oil. Outside traffic droned past, endless and indifferent. Margaret whispered the only answer that made sense, though it didn't make enough sense, not yet. Maybe because we're the only family he had left. That evening, after a dinner of ramen noodles stretched with frozen peas, they sat at their tiny table and called the number on the letterhead. A man answered on the 4th ring, his voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who says what he means and means what he says. Finch and Associates, Harold Finch speaking. Thomas cleared his throat. This is Thomas Brennan. My wife Margaret and I received a letter about an inheritance from my cousin Elias. The Brennans. Something shifted in Finch's voice, a note of quiet satisfaction, like a man watching a package finally arrive after a long wait. I've been hoping to hear from you. Is the property valuable? We don't have much. Moving would be difficult. A pause. Careful words. The cabin is remote. Very remote. No utilities, no power lines. Built in the 1950s, rustic but maintained. It's yours free and clear. You could sell it though, land out there doesn't move fast. Or you could live there. Another pause. Elias did. For 37 years, he seemed happy enough. Thomas and Margaret looked at each other across the table, across 52 years of marriage, across the distance between what they had and what they'd lost. An entire conversation passed between them in silence. We don't have money for travel. Thomas's voice carried the shame of a man admitting something that cost more than money to say. Elias anticipated that. Finch's tone softened the way voices soften around wounds. He left a fund specifically for your travel, $1,500, enough to get you here, get you settled, and give you time to see the place before deciding. He was very particular about that. Said he wanted you to see it with your own eyes. Margaret leaned toward the phone. Why us? Why would he leave us his home when he barely knew us? The silence that followed was the kind that holds weight. Then Harold Finch said quietly, "He told me once that you were good people, that Thomas had integrity, that Margaret had kindness." A breath. He didn't elaborate, but he was very clear about his wishes. The property goes to you and no one else. They talked for another 20 minutes. Logistics paperwork, bus schedules. When they hung up, the apartment was dark except for the lamp with the crooked shade, and the sounds from the restaurant below had faded to the occasional clatter of someone mopping the kitchen floor. Thomas reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "What do you think, She stared at their joined hands, his knuckles swollen with arthritis, hers spotted with age. Two hands that had built and lost and held on and let go so many times they'd forgotten the difference. "I think we don't have anything left to lose." 3 days later, Thomas called Rachel. He called her first because she was the oldest, because somewhere inside the woman who demanded their house money and their dignity, there was still a 5-year-old pointing at clouds from his shoulders, naming them after animals that don't exist. She answered on the 5th ring. "Dad, I'm in the middle of something. We received some news. Your mother's cousin Elias passed away. He left us property in Montana, a cabin on some land. We're going to see it." Silence. The particular silence of someone recalculating. "Property? What kind of property?" "A cabin." Rachel laughed and the sound had edges. "A cabin in Montana, Dad, that's ridiculous. You can barely walk to the mailbox." Margaret took the phone. "We're not asking permission, Rachel. We're letting you know." Rachel's voice sharpened like a blade pulled across stone. "After everything we've done for you, just sign it over to me. I'll handle the sale. We'll split the money." Thomas leaned close. "It's not yours to handle, Rachel. So that's how it is." Her voice climbed. "Fine. Go freeze in the woods. But don't come crying to us when you realize it's a shack with squirrels in the walls." She hung up. The dial tone hummed in the apartment like a flat line. Kyle called them ungrateful. Emma texted 3 hours later. "Busy, can't talk, hope you're okay." Michael sent 5 words that Thomas read, once deleted, and never repeated. That night, Margaret found Thomas sitting on the edge of the bed, his shoulders shaking. She sat beside him and pulled him close, and they stayed like that for a long time, while the building creaked around them and the mice moved through the walls, and somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off, and nobody came to silence it. "Let them go," she said again, and this time the words weren't a whisper. They were a decision. 2 weeks later, on a cold November morning, they stood at the Greyhound terminal with everything they owned in 2 duffel bags and a backpack. The bags were light because their lives had become light in the way that empty rooms are light, not free, just vacant. Margaret wore the navy blue wool coat she'd owned since 1992, its buttons replaced, twice its lining patched with fabric from a dress she no longer fit. Thomas wore his flannel-lined denim jacket with patches on both elbows, the kind of jacket that stops being clothing and becomes a companion after enough years. The bus rumbled at the curb, exhaust curling into gray morning air that smelled like diesel and goodbye. They climbed aboard slowly, Thomas gripping the handrail with both hands, Margaret steadying his elbow the way she had done 10,000 times, without either of them acknowledging it had become necessary. They found seats near the back, away from the young people sealed inside headphones, away from the businessman typing furiously, as if the world depended on whatever email he was composing. As the bus pulled away from the terminal, Margaret looked out the window one last time at the town they were leaving behind. Somewhere in those streets were 4 people who had once fit inside her body, one at a time, who had once reached for her in the dark, who had once called her the only word that mattered. Somewhere in those streets, those 4 people were going about their mornings without wondering where their parents were. She felt the loss settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. But beneath it, deeper, something else stirred. Something she hadn't felt in years, faint as a pulse in her wrist, you're not sure is still alive. Hope. The bus carried them through Ohio, where the land stretched flat and stubborn, through Indiana, where grain elevators rose from the fields like monuments to patience, through Illinois, where the sky seemed wider than any sky had a right to be. They slept in shifts. Margaret's head on Thomas's shoulder, Thomas's cheek pressed against cold glass that fogged with every breath. They ate gas station sandwiches wrapped in plastic that crinkled like the letter from Montana. They drank coffee from styrofoam cups that burned their fingers and warmed nothing else. And slowly, mile by mile, the land changed. The flatness gave way to rolls, then slopes, then true hills muscled with rock. Trees thickened. Rivers appeared cutting through valleys, silver and purposeful. And then, crossing into Montana on the third day, the world opened. Mountains rose ahead of them, not gently but suddenly, as if the earth had taken a breath and held it. Their peaks wore early snow that caught the low November sun and burned white gold against a sky so blue it looked like something a child would paint and an adult wouldn't believe. Pine forests stretched unbroken to horizons that kept retreating, promising more, always more. Margaret pressed her palm against the window. The glass was cold. The view was not. "It's beautiful," she said. And Thomas, who hadn't spoken in an hour, took her other hand and held it. Harold Finch met them at the Helena station in a dust-colored pickup with Montana plates and a bumper sticker that read, "Keep Montana Wild." He was older than he had sounded on the phone, maybe 70 himself, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved by the same wind that shaped the mountains. His handshake was firm. His eyes were kind. "Glad you made it." He loaded their bags into the truck bed with the ease of a man who'd spent his life lifting things. About an hour's drive to the property. Roads get rough near the end. They drove through Helena first. The town spreading through valleys between mountains, its buildings carrying the particular dignity of places that have survived long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. Then the city fell away, and the road narrowed pavement, surrendering to gravel trees, pressing closer branches reaching overhead until the truck moved through a tunnel of pine and fading light. The air through the vents smelled like something Margaret had no word for. Clean, yes. Cold, yes. But something else. Something that filled the lungs and kept filling them, as if she'd been breathing shallowly for 3 years, and only now remembered what a full breath felt like. "Elias bought this land in 1953, Finch said, one hand easy on the wheel. "Paid cash. Built the cabin himself over 2 summers, lived in a tent while he worked." He glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "He talked about you sometimes, not often, but when he did it was with respect. Said you reminded him of a time when people still kept their word." Margaret's throat tightened. "We barely knew him." Finch shrugged the way mountains shrug off weather. "Sometimes family isn't about how much time you spend together. It's about character. He saw something in you worth protecting." The truck turned onto a dirt road that climbed into the hills, ruts and stones, making the chassis sway and groan. Branches scraped the sides like fingers asking to be let in. The sun had set, leaving only a thin glow along the western ridge, and the truck's headlights cutting through darkness that felt ancient. Then the trees opened. And there, standing in a clearing like something that had grown from the ground rather than been built upon it, was the cabin. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs darkened by weather and decades to the color of dark honey. A steep green metal roof rusted at the edges but still holding strong. A stone chimney rising from the center, solid and certain. A wide porch wrapping the front, its railings carved with patterns of leaves and vines. Windows catching the last light and holding it glowing soft amber, as if the house had been waiting with a lamp on. Behind it, mountains rose black against a sky turning purple. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called out. Low, patient, knowing. Finch put the truck in park and killed the engine. The silence that followed was so complete it had texture. No traffic, no sirens. No voices raised in argument through thin walls. just wind in pine branches and the tick of the engine cooling, and Margaret's own heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears. Home, Finch said. Just the one word. They climbed out slowly, legs stiff from 3 days of sitting, and stood in the clearing. The cold air hit Margaret's face like a hand placed gently on a fever. She pressed both palms against her chest and stared. Thomas moved beside her. Neither spoke. The moment was too full for words and too fragile for silence, so they simply stood, two people at the edge of something they didn't yet understand, letting it wash over them. The way the first warm day of spring washes over ground that has been frozen so long it forgot what thaw feels like. Finch pulled their bags from the truck bed and set them on the porch. Then he reached into his coat pocket and drew out a single key. Brass. Old. Worn smooth by decades of use, its teeth rounded its surface, carrying the particular warmth of metal that has been held by human hands 10,000 times. He placed it in Thomas's palm. Thomas closed his fingers around it, and for a moment his hand did not shake. No mortgage, Finch said. No taxes owed. Elias paid everything 50 years forward through a trust. There's a well-out backhand pump still works. Solar panels on the south side. Root cellar for storage. He paused. He lived simply, but he lived well. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks before she knew she was crying. Why would he do this for us? Finch's expression shifted, the professional mask softening into something personal, something that had been waiting to be said. He told me once that the world had enough takers. He wanted to leave something to people who knew how to receive with grace. He climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and lifted a hand through the open window. Care package inside. Food, blankets, firewood. I'll be back next week for paperwork. His taillights shrank into the trees and vanished, leaving Thomas and Margaret alone with the cabin and the mountains and the silence, and a brass key that felt heavier than anything that small should feel. Stars began to appear. Not the faint, light-polluted suggestions of stars they'd seen from Beckley, but real stars, fierce and countless, flung across the darkness like salt thrown over a shoulder for luck. The Milky Way arched overhead, and Margaret tilted her face up and felt something inside her chest, uncurled something that had been clenched for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Thomas walked towards the cabin. Margaret followed. Their footsteps on the porch boards sounded solid, real, like the first notes of a song they'd been waiting their whole lives to hear. He slid the brass key into the lock. It turned without resistance, smooth as a promise kept. The door opened with a soft creak, and warm air rolled out, carrying the scent of cedar and wood smoke and thyme. Thomas found a switch on the wall. Solar-powered lights came on soft and steady. The main room stretched before them, larger than their entire apartment, larger than the life they had been living for 3 years. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes whose spines had faded, but whose pages Margaret somehow knew were still sharp. A stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its mantel carved from a single piece of oak leaves, and birds emerging from the grain, as if the wood itself had dreamed them. The furniture was handmade, a leather couch worn smooth as riverstone, a wooden table with 6 chairs, each one slightly different, each one perfect. White plank pine floors, burnished by decades of footsteps, glowed in the lamplight. Hand-woven rugs, oil lamps filled and ready, photographs in simple wooden frames. Margaret walked inside, slowly touching the back of a chair, the edge of a shelf, the stone of the fireplace. Every surface carried the warmth of intention, the evidence of a life lived deliberately. She picked up a photograph, a younger Elias, perhaps 40, standing beside this very cabin in summer. He was holding a fishing rod, and he was smiling. Not the polite, guarded expression she remembered from the 2 times they'd met, but a real smile, the kind that starts somewhere deep and arrives on the face like sunlight breaking through trees. Thomas found firewood stacked beside the hearth, kindling arranged in a basket with the precision of someone who understood that warmth is not a luxury, but a right. On the mantel beside the carved birds sat a note in careful handwriting. Welcome home. Make it yours, Elias. Thomas's hands trembled as he held the paper. Margaret read it over his shoulder and felt something break inside her. that had needed breaking for a very long time. Not her heart. Her heart had broken years ago. This was something else. A wall, a resignation. The hard protective shell she'd built around the part of herself that still believed good things could happen to good people. He pulled her close, and they stood in the center of the room, surrounded by evidence of one man's quiet faith in them. The fire Thomas built that night caught quickly flames climbing through cedar splits, filling the room with warmth and the smell of something ancient and alive. Margaret found blankets in a chest-heavy wool that smelled like lavender, and they sat together on the leather couch, wrapped in quilts, watching the fire. For the first time in 3 years, they were not cold. For the first time in longer than that, they were not afraid. Outside wind whispered through pines. A wolf howled somewhere distant, its voice rising and falling like a question the mountains had been asking long before people arrived to hear it. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. Thomas took her hand. His grip was warm. The brass key sat on the mantel beside Elias's note, catching firelight, glowing like a small ember that refused to go out. "We made it, Maggie." She nodded against his shoulder. "Yeah, we did." They didn't know yet what lay beneath the stone floor. They didn't know about the vault, the fortune, the journals spanning 30 years of secret brilliance. They didn't know that their children would come circling like crows to carrion, or that a dead man's foresight would prove sharper than any living cruelty. They didn't know that the brass key Thomas had tucked into his shirt pocket close to his heart was not just a key to a cabin, but to everything that would come after. They knew only this: they had a roof, they had a fire, they had each other. And for two people who'd been told in 100 small ways that they were finished, that was more than enough. That was the beginning. The first morning came in silence. Not the silence of absence, the kind that filled their apartment above the restaurant. The kind that meant nobody cared enough to make noise. This was a different silence. Alive, breathing. The silence of a place that had been waiting. Margaret woke before dawn and lay still, disoriented by the darkness and the quiet and the smell of cedar instead of cooking oil. Thomas slept beside her, his breathing deeper and more even than she'd heard in years, as if his body had been holding its breath for 3 years and had finally, in this bed, in this cabin, decided it was safe to exhale. She slipped out from under the quilts and padded barefoot to the window. Dawn was breaking over the mountains in colors she had no names for: pinks that deepened into golds that caught fire along the ridgeline and set the snowcaps burning. Mist lay in the valleys between the trees like something pawed there overnight. And at the edge of the clearing, a doe stood, motionless, ears turning like small satellite dishes before bounding into the forest without a sound. Margaret pressed her palm against the cold glass and felt something shift behind her ribs. Not pain. Something older than pain. A door she'd locked so long ago she'd forgotten the room behind it existed. She went downstairs and worked the hand pump at the kitchen sink until water came in stuttering bursts, then steady, then clear. It tasted clean and cold and faintly sweet, nothing like the metallic water from Beckley that always carried the ghost of old pipes. She found coffee in the care package and made it on the wood stove, the process unfamiliar and slow. The iron surface hotter than she expected in some places, and cooler in others, so that the first pot boiled over and she had to start again. When Thomas came down 20 minutes later, rubbing sleep from his face, she handed him a mug. They sat together at the wooden table and watched light move across the room like a guest arriving unhurried. Thomas spoke first. "I slept through the night." Margaret nodded. "Me too." He wrapped both hands around the mug, and for a moment neither of them moved. They both understood what that meant. Not just rest, but the absence of fear. The body's quiet declaration that it no longer needed to stay alert through the dark hours listening for the next loss. The days that followed had no shape, which was itself a kind of freedom. There were no bus schedules, no shifts to check, no waiting rooms to sit in, while strangers decided their worth. Instead, there was wood to split, and Thomas learned quickly that his shaking hands could still swing an axe if he adjusted his grip. Bracing the handle lower, letting the weight of the tool do the work his muscles no longer could. The first day he split only 4 logs before his arms gave out. The second day, 6. By the end of the week, a small pile stood beside the porch, uneven and ragged, each piece cut at a slightly different angle, but dry and ready to burn. Margaret tackled the kitchen. The wood stove had moods. She had to learn which damper controlled the heat, which burner plate could hold a cast iron skillet without wobbling, how long the embers needed to ash over before she could bake. She burned 3 batches of biscuits before the fourth came out golden and crumbling, and she set one on a plate in front of Thomas with a look that dared him to comment on the ones she'd thrown away. He didn't. He just ate it slowly, eyes closed, and when he finished, his voice came out rough around the edges. "That's the best thing I've tasted in 3 years." She didn't say it was just a biscuit. They both knew it wasn't. They explored the property in slow circles each day, venturing a little farther. Margaret found a stream on the western edge, shallow and quick over smooth stones. Its sound a constant murmur that reminded her of the way her mother used to hum while doing dishes. Thomas discovered the remains of what had once been a garden plot, the soil dark and rich, fenced in by wire that had rusted into lace. They found a grove of aspens on the southern slope, whose leaves had turned gold and rattled like coins in the wind, and a rocky outcrop above the cabin that offered a view of the valley so wide it made Margaret's breath catch every time. They talked more than they had in years, not about the children, not about the money, about other things, older things. Things they'd packed away so carefully, they'd nearly forgotten the boxes existed. The church social in 1971, where Thomas had been too shy to ask her to dance, standing by the punch bowl in his only good shirt, until Margaret walked up and asked him instead. The honeymoon at Niagara Falls, where it rained every day, and they hadn't cared because the room had a bathtub, and they were 21, and everything was beginning. Thomas told her he'd always wanted to learn woodworking, real woodworking. Not engine repair, not fixing what was broken, but building something new from raw material. Margaret admitted she'd wanted to paint, watercolors maybe, the way light hit mountains. "Maybe now there's time," Thomas said, and the sentence hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither of them had realized they were building. But as the days turned into weeks, Margaret noticed things. It started with the floors. Certain boards specifically in front of the fireplace and along the north wall sounded different when she walked across them. Not the solid thud of pine on stone foundation, but something hollower, as if the wood were a drum skin stretched over empty space. Then the dimensions. Standing outside one afternoon, Margaret paced the cabin's northern wall. 32 steps. Inside the same wall measured only 26 steps, even accounting for the thickness of the logs. 6 steps of space unaccounted for, gone or hidden. She mentioned it to Thomas that evening while the fire burned low. "Something feels off about the layout. The inside is smaller than the outside." Thomas looked up from the journal. He'd been reading one of Elias's maintenance ledgers filled with notes about well pumps and shingle repairs. His eyes narrowed the way they used to narrow when an engine made a sound that didn't belong. "I haven't seen stairs going down, but you're right, the numbers don't add up." They began looking, not frantically but methodically, the way two people who've spent their lives working with their hands approach a mechanical problem. Thomas tapped walls and listened for changes in resonance. Margaret ran her fingers along every seam, every joint, every place where wood met stone. The fireplace drew her back again and again. It was massive, taking up nearly the entire north wall, built from river stones, fitted together with a precision that seemed almost obsessive. She'd admired the carved mantel before, the oak leaves and birds emerging from the wood. Now she studied it differently, not as art but as architecture, as something designed to contain a secret. Her fingers moved over the carvings, tracing each leaf, each feather, each curl of vine. And then, on the third evening of searching deep within the curve of a carved oak leaf on the right side of the mantel, her fingertips settled into an indentation no larger than a shirt button. She pressed it. Nothing happened. The fire crackled. Thomas coughed in his sleep upstairs. The wind leaned against the cabin walls and moved on. But something had changed in Margaret's chest. A certainty. The kind of certainty that comes not from evidence, but from the particular silence that follows when you've knocked on the right door and the person inside hasn't answered yet. She couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, she went back downstairs, lit an oil lamp, and returned to the fireplace. This time, she ignored the mantel and focused on the stones themselves. Each one unique, some round, others angular, fitted together like a puzzle whose picture she couldn't yet see. She pressed them systematically, starting from the bottom left, working across and up. Most didn't move. They were stone, after all, and stone doesn't yield to old women's fingers at 2 in the morning in Montana. But then, 4 feet up, right side, a stone roughly the size of her palm, slightly darker than its neighbors, set deeper into the mortar. It moved, not much, a quarter-inch. But in a wall that had been built to last a century, a quarter-inch was a confession. She pressed harder. The stone sank inward with a sound that was less a click and more a sigh, as if something that had been holding its breath for 30 years had finally been given permission to exhale. Silence. Then a grinding below her feet. Stone against stone. The sound of weight shifting underground. Margaret stepped back. The oil lamp shook in her hand, throwing shadows that lunged and retreated across the walls. In front of the fireplace, a section of floor had separated from the rest. A hairline crack ruler, straight, forming a perfect square roughly 4 feet across. A crack that had not been there before. Thomas! Her voice was a whisper that couldn't decide whether it was terrified or thrilled. Then louder. Thomas! He appeared at the top of the stairs, hair, wild eyes wide, with the particular alertness of a man yanked from sleep by a voice he's trusted for 52 years. What's wrong? Come here, now. He descended carefully, and she pointed. They knelt together, running their fingers along the crack. The seam was too precise to be settling, too straight to be damage. This was made. Intended. Waiting. Thomas retrieved a flathead screwdriver from the workbench. He'd already organized Elias's tools, the way he'd organized his own shop, by instinct and by love, and worked the blade into the seam. The panel lifted with surprising ease, heavy, but balanced, a thick slab of pine disguised perfectly to match the surrounding floor. Beneath it, stone steps descended into darkness. They looked at each other across the open hole. The oil lamp flickered between them, painting their faces in amber and shadow. Should we? Margaret whispered. Thomas picked up the brass key from the mantel where he'd left it each night, the habit already unconscious, and closed his fist around it. We have to. He went first, carefully testing each step, his hand against the stone wall for balance. Margaret followed, holding the lamp high. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved directly into bedrock 12 steps down. The air grew cooler with each one, carrying the smell of stone and stillness. And something else, the particular mustiness of a space sealed against time. At the bottom, the lamp's light reached only a few feet in every direction, creating a small island of gold in what felt like an ocean of dark. Thomas took the lamp and raised it, turning slowly. The light caught the edge of a wooden crate. Then the gleam of brass, then glass, then more crates stacked carefully against walls that stretched beyond the reach of the flame. Margaret's breath stopped. They were standing in a chamber roughly the size of the room above them. Vaulted ceiling supported by hand-hewn beams. Walls of smooth stone fitted with the same impossible precision as the fireplace. And filling this space, organized with the care of a museum and the secrecy of a tomb, was a collection that would take them hours to even begin to comprehend. Wooden crates lined every wall, stacked 2 and 3 high, each one labeled in neat handwriting with numbers and codes. Shelves held leather-bound books with gold-embossed spines. Wooden boxes of every size, some small enough to cup in a palm, others too large for one person to lift. A massive oak desk sat in the center of the room, its surface arranged with military precision papers in neat stacks. A leather journal open as if someone had stepped away mid-sentence. A brass lamp with a green glass shade. And in the far corner, something large draped in canvas, its shape suggesting curves and angles that didn't belong underground. Thomas set the oil lamp on the desk and picked up the leather journal. Margaret moved beside him. The first page in elegant script, Private Collection and Estate Records. Property of Elias James Brennan, begun January 7, 1963. Updated through September 2, 1994, not for public record. Below that, in different ink, added later the handwriting slightly less steady. For Thomas and Margaret, should you choose to look, everything here is yours now. I trust you'll know what to do. Elias. Margaret turned the page. What followed was meticulous. Page after page of entries. Items, dates, prices paid, authentication certificates, estimated values. Each entry written with the precision of a man who understood that care is a form of love. She read the first entry aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. April 15, 1963. Landscape by Albert Bierstadt. Oil on canvas 36 by 24 inches. Purchased from estate sale, Portland. $375. She stopped. Thomas, the current estimated value. It says 52,000. Thomas flipped ahead. His finger traced a column of numbers that climbed like mountain trails. June 1964. First edition Shakespeare folio. Purchased for $800, current estimated value. His voice dropped. 120,000. They opened the nearest crate together. Inside, wrapped in newspaper from 1968, was a painting. Thomas lifted it gently, peeling back the yellowed paper. Even in lamplight, the colors held depth, and fire mountains and clouds rendered in strokes that seemed to breathe. The signature in the lower corner, A. Bierstadt. Another crate. A smaller painting. A woman in a garden, impressionist brushwork, the light falling through leaves onto her shoulders like something you could feel. The signature, Mary Cassatt. And then Thomas found the older journal. This one was different. Its leather cover cracked and worn, its pages filled not with inventory records, but with handwriting that was smaller, more private. The kind of writing a person does when they're talking to themselves. He opened it and began reading. And what emerged from those pages was not a collector's ledger, but a life. Elias had married a woman named Ruth in 1948. They'd had a daughter, Lillian, born in 1950. 2 years of family. 2 years of the life Elias had built everything else to replace. On March 14, 1952, Ruth and Lillian were killed by a logging truck that ran a red light on Highway 2 outside Kalispell. Lillian was 22 months old. Ruth was 27. The entry that followed was dated 6 months later, September 1952. The handwriting shook. I could not save them. I could not hold the truck back with my hands. I could not stop time. I could not do anything but stand at 2 graves and understand that the world does not care whether you are good or not, whether you deserve what happens or not. It simply happens. A page later, steadier. I have decided to build something, not a life. A life requires people, and I cannot risk people again. But something that proves beauty outlasts grief. Something that lasts longer than 2 years and 22 months. Margaret's hand covered her mouth. Thomas kept reading. Moved to Montana, bought land no one wanted. Will build a cabin. Will fill it with things that deserve to be saved. Will become the kind of man who saves things since I could not save the only things that mattered. The silence in the vault was absolute. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a cathedral, a space designed to hold something too large for sound. Margaret took the journal from Thomas's hands and turned to a later entry, 1973. Saw Thomas and Margaret at Mother's funeral today. Didn't speak to them. They wouldn't remember me. But I watched. Saw how Thomas held his brothers when they couldn't stand. Saw how Margaret organized everything without taking credit. They care for everyone and no one cares for them. I recognize that. I was married to a woman like that. She died because I couldn't protect her. Perhaps I can protect them. Thomas's voice came out broken. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was building something for Ruth, for Lillian, and then for us. They found the final page together, September 2nd, 1994. The last entry. Total estimated value of collection $265 million. To Thomas and Margaret Brennan, my distant cousins and the only family who never asked me for anything. In a world of takers, you remained givers. This collection represents 37 years of faith that beauty is worth preserving. Use it to build the life you deserve. With respect and affection, Elias James Brennan. Margaret sank onto a crate, her legs finally giving way. Thomas set the journal down with the care of a man handling something sacred. He turned to her, his face pale in the lamplight. Maggie, this can't be real. But it was real. The evidence surrounded them. And the brass key in his pocket pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. Because Elias had not given them a cabin. He had given them a cathedral built from grief and patience and the stubborn belief that somewhere in the world there were still people worth trusting. They stayed in the vault until dawn crept through the cabin above them, visible as a thin line of gray around the edges of the hidden door. When they finally climbed back up and sealed the floor, the panel fit so perfectly that even knowing it was there, Margaret had to look twice to find the seam. Thomas made coffee while Margaret sat at the kitchen table staring at her hands. Neither of them had slept, but sleep seemed irrelevant now, a small concern from a smaller life. "We can't tell anyone," Thomas said quietly. "Not yet." Margaret nodded. The children, if they found out. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. They both knew what Rachel would do, what Kyle would demand, how quickly the vultures would circle. That afternoon, needing to move, needing to breathe, they drove the truck Finch had helped them buy into Cedar Falls. The town was exactly what a town of 347 people looks like when it has stopped pretending to be anything other than what it is. A general store with a wooden porch, a diner with a hand-lettered menu in the window, a gas station, a post office, and a small brick building with a sign that read, Cedar Falls Public Library. Open Tuesday to Saturday 9 to 4. Donations welcome. Margaret had noticed the library on their first pass through town, but hadn't stopped. Now she pushed through the door, and the smell that greeted her old paper wood polish, the particular warmth of a room full of books, made her eyes sting. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She looked up as they entered, and her face opened into a smile that had no performance in it, only welcome. "You must be the Brennans. Word travels in a town this size. I'm Dorothy Harwell, librarian, local historian, and keeper of community knowledge, though some people call it gossip." She stood and extended a hand that was small but sure. "I hoped you'd come in." Over the next 2 hours, Dorothy told them what she knew about Elias. Not the collection that she had only suspected, pieced together from decades of watching deliveries arrive at his property. Large crates marked fragile visitors in city clothes who didn't belong on mountain roads. He kept to himself, she said, pouring tea from a thermos into chipped mugs. Came to town once a month for supplies. Polite but private. Some people thought he was crazy. Others thought he was dangerous. She sipped her tea. "I thought he was the smartest man I'd ever met." She pulled newspaper clippings from a folder, art magazines, financial papers spanning decades. In the margins, penciled notes in Dorothy's handwriting. Elias invested in Apple 1976. Elias bought Wyeth paintings before anyone knew the name. "You tracked him?" Thomas asked. Dorothy shrugged. "Small town, long winters, and I was curious." Then she reached under the desk and brought out one more thing. A photograph in a cracked frame. A younger Elias, maybe 35, standing not alone but with a woman, Ruth. She was holding a baby. All three of them stood in front of the cabin, and Elias was looking not at the camera but at the child, and the expression on his face was the one Margaret recognized from every photograph she had ever seen of Thomas holding their own children for the first time. Unguarded. Destroyed by love. "He gave me this years ago," Dorothy said quietly. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should give it to whoever came to live in his cabin. Said they'd want to know he'd been happy once. Margaret held the photograph with both hands and felt the room blur. On their way out of town, they passed a small house set back from the road, its porch cluttered with flower pots and wind chimes. An older woman, perhaps 78, stood in the yard wearing a paint-stained apron, wrestling with a garden hose. That's Hattie Colvin, Dorothy had told them earlier. Retired school teacher, 40 years at the consolidated school. She's the only person in Cedar Falls Elias ever invited to tea. Margaret stopped the truck. Thomas looked at her and she shrugged. Dorothy said she knew him. Hattie Colvin's handshake was stronger than her frame suggested, and her eyes, bright blue behind bifocals, held the particular intelligence of someone who'd spent 4 decades watching children and learning everything about adults in the process. So you're the ones Elias chose. She looked them over the way a teacher looks at new students, not judging, but assessing. Come in, I just made lemon cake and I'm too old to eat it all myself. Inside her kitchen was warm and cluttered with the evidence of a life lived fully, books, stacked on every surface, watercolor paintings tacked to the walls, a cat the color of marmalade sleeping on a chair. I went to his cabin for tea once a month for 20 years. Hattie said, cutting cake with a knife that had been sharpened so many times the blade curved. We talked about art, about books, about what education is supposed to do and what it actually does. He was lonely, though he'd never admit it. She set a plate in front of Margaret. He showed me a painting once. A woman in a garden holding a child. The brushwork was beautiful, soft, like the artist was afraid pressing too hard would break the moment. Hattie's hands stilled on the knife. Elias's hands shook when he held it. I never asked who they were. Some doors you don't open for other people. You wait until they open them for you. Margaret thought of the vault, the portrait she hadn't yet found, the woman and the child who explained everything. That night back at the cabin, Thomas stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Margaret was outside walking the perimeter the way she did each evening, checking the property. The way you check a sleeping child, not because you expect something wrong, but because the checking itself is an act of love. Thomas looked at his reflection. The face was older than he expected every time, as if the mirror aged faster than he did. His hands rested on the edge of the sink, and they trembled, the left worse than the right, a fine vibration that never fully stopped. $265 million beneath his feet, a dead man's trust in his pocket, a wife outside who believed in him. And these hands, these useless shaking hands that couldn't hold a wrench anymore, that couldn't sign his name without the letters wandering off the line, that couldn't do the one thing hands are supposed to do, which is hold on. He picked up the brass key from the shelf beside the mirror, closed his fist around it, squeezed until the teeth bit into his palm and the pain was sharp and clear and real. His hand steadied, not completely, but enough. He looked at his reflection and spoke to it the way you speak to someone you're not sure you trust, but are willing to try. I may shake, but I don't break. The words hung in the steam from the sink, and then they were gone, and Thomas put the key back on the shelf and went downstairs to build the fire, because that was something his hands could still do, and doing it mattered. 3 weeks passed. The vault remained sealed. Thomas and Margaret had contacted Mr. Finch, who brought Patricia Ortega from Billings, small, precise, with the particular focus of someone whose intelligence has been sharpened by years of adversarial work. She spent 3 days underground photographing, cataloging, cross-referencing everything with Elias's records. Her professional composure cracked only once standing before an open crate containing a signed letter from Abraham Lincoln. This documentation is extraordinary, she said, her voice carrying a reverence that had nothing to do with money. Your cousin was meticulous, every acquisition legal, every provenance verified, every appraisal current. She paused. But you need to understand what comes next. An estate this size attracts attention. The IRS, auction houses, press. She looked at them directly. And your family. They knew. They'd been waiting for that storm the way farmers wait for hail, knowing it's coming, knowing they can't stop it, knowing the only question is how much damage it does when it arrives. The storm broke on a Tuesday. Margaret was in the kitchen when Thomas's phone rang. She saw his face lose color before he spoke, and she knew. It's Kyle. They'd changed their numbers, given the new ones only to Finch and Patricia, which meant someone had talked, someone who knew where they were. Thomas answered. Kyle's voice came through loud enough for Margaret to hear from across the room, and it carried the particular fury of a man who believes he's been cheated out of something he never earned. So it's true. You're sitting on a fortune and you weren't going to tell us. Who told you? Doesn't matter. What matters is you've been lying. I know about Elias. I know what he was. And I know everything he owned is now yours, which means it's ours too. We're family. Tomas's knuckles whitened around the phone. You have no right to anything. You gave up that right when you took everything we had and threw us away. Kyle's voice dropped to something colder than anger. You want to go to war with your own children. We'll fight you. We'll prove you're not competent. We'll get guardianship and then everything is ours anyway. The words landed in the kitchen like stones thrown through glass. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter. How did you find out? Thomas asked. Kyle laughed. You've got a neighbor. Chatty woman Dolores lives a few miles down the mountain. She saw fancy cars going up to your place. Lawyers, appraisers. She mentioned it to her daughter, who mentioned it to a friend, who happens to know Emma's husband. His voice turned to ice. We're coming up there, all of us, tomorrow, and we're going to settle this. The line went dead. Thomas lowered the phone slowly. His hand was shaking again badly now, the tremor moving up his wrist into his forearm. They know, and they're coming. Margaret sank into a chair. We were so careful. Thomas looked at her with an expression she had never seen in 52 years. Not anger exactly, but something fiercer, protective. The look of a man whose hands may shake, but whose spine does not. They're not taking this from us. Elias left it to us, and they are not taking it. They called Finch. He arrived within the hour with Patricia and a third lawyer. Robert Kane from Bozeman, tall and composed, specializing in defending against guardianship claims. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, reviewing the trust, reinforcing legal walls. The trust is airtight, Patricia assured them. Even if they want guardianship, which they won't, they can't access the assets. Robert added, we get medical evaluations confirming your competency. We document their history of financial abuse. We show the court exactly who the threat really is. But Margaret sat apart from the legal talk, staring out the window at the darkening forest, the photograph of Elias and Ruth and Lillian in her lap. She thought about a man who'd lost everything and spent 37 years building a fortress out of beauty, only to leave it to two people he barely knew but somehow understood. They can't have it, she said quietly. And the lawyer stopped talking because her voice carried something their legal arguments didn't. Certainty. The kind that comes not from documents, but from the bone-deep knowledge that some things are sacred, and this was one of them. The next afternoon, 3 vehicles turned onto the property in formation. A BMW, an SUV, a pickup that had seen better decades. Doors opened, simultaneously rehearsed, aggressive. Rachel first dressed in clothes that cost more than Thomas and Margaret's monthly expenses. Kyle behind her face, already flushed. Emma emerging slowly, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. And behind them, 2 strangers, a man in a suit carrying a briefcase and a woman with a camera. Margaret's stomach dropped. They brought a lawyer and a photographer. Thomas opened the cabin door before they could knock. He stood in the frame, one hand on the doorpost, the other in his pocket. Fingers wrapped around the brass key. Rachel smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the conversation is a transaction. Hello, Dad, aren't you going to invite us in? No. The lawyer Gerald Thorne stepped forward with documents. Guardianship petitions, claims of diminished capacity. Allegations of manipulation by outside parties. Language designed to make two competent adults sound like children who'd wandered off and needed bringing home. Margaret appeared beside Thomas, $265 million. If you're going to come here demanding our money, at least get the number right. The confrontation lasted 20 minutes. Thomas told them what they were. Rachel's mask cracked. Kyle threatened. Emma stared at the ground. The photographer's shutter clicked constantly, each snap a small theft. When they finally left gravel spitting under tires, Thomas sank onto the porch steps and put his head in his hands. They're going to destroy us. Margaret sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. We're not the same people they left in that apartment above the Golden Dragon. We're not powerless anymore. She reached into his pocket, took the brass key and pressed it into his palm. He looked at it, looked at her, and we're not alone. Within hours, Cedar Falls responded. Dorothy called first, her voice tight with fury about Dolores and privacy, and what happens to gossips in small towns. Sheriff Tom Whitaker called next, offering patrols his personal cell number and a warning to anyone who bothered them. The general store owner offered deliveries. The mechanic offered free maintenance. Even Dolores called, apologizing through tears after Dorothy had apparently delivered a lecture that would have stripped paint from barn doors. Hattie Colvin arrived at the cabin door the next morning with a casserole dish and a look that could have stopped a charging bull. I taught school for 40 years, she said, setting the dish on the counter. I've dealt with every kind of bully there is. Your children are the worst kind, the kind who think love is a balance sheet. She squeezed Margaret's hand. Elias chose you because you're worth choosing. Don't you forget that. But the children didn't stop. Gerald Thorne filed motions. Rachel gave interviews to a regional newspaper, crying on camera about concerned children and confused elderly parents. The headline made Margaret's hands tremble. Family fights for control of reclusive millionaire's fortune. Kyle hired a private investigator. Someone broke into the cabin while they were in town. Nothing stolen but drawers opened. Papers scattered, the violation complete. Sheriff Whitaker posted a deputy at night. Robert Kane built their legal defense. The community rallied. But each day brought a new attack, a new motion, a new article, a new way of saying that Thomas and Margaret Brennan were too old, too poor, too broken to deserve what they'd been given. Then, 2 days before the court hearing at 10 in the evening, Margaret's phone rang. Michael. She answered with a voice carved from stone. What do you want? A long silence, then broken. To tell you I'm sorry, that I know this is wrong, that I've withdrawn my name from the petitions. Why now? Why not before they broke into our home? Because I finally realized what we did to you, what I did. His voice cracked like ice in spring. I took your money and told myself I deserved it because I'm your son. But I didn't deserve it. None of us did. We stole from you and then blamed you when there was nothing left to steal. A whisper now. Elias saw that. He knew what we were. That's why he left everything to you. And he was right. Margaret closed her eyes. Tears fell. The others won't stop. Michael continued. Rachel thinks this is her payday. Kyle borrowed money to pay the lawyers. They're desperate. His voice steadied just enough to carry a warning. Please be careful. The line went quiet. Margaret told Thomas. He listened without expression, then said, Too little, too late. Maybe, Margaret replied, but it's something. That night, the storm that had been threatening for days finally arrived. Wind screamed through the canyon. Rain hammered the metal roof in sheets. Lightning split the sky above the mountains and thunder rolled through the valley, like something old and furious waking up. Thomas stood at the window watching the storm, his reflection superimposed over the violence outside. Margaret sat by the fire with Finch and Patricia and Robert going over documents one last time. The case was strong. Everyone said so. But courtrooms were unpredictable, especially when family was involved, especially when the family in question had decided that love was just another word for leverage. Thomas spoke without turning from the window, his voice barely audible above the storm. When did we lose them? When did our children become strangers? Nobody answered. There was no answer. There was only the wind and the rain and the fire burning low, and four people in a cabin built by a man who had learned decades ago that the ones who should love you most are sometimes the ones who hurt you worst. Margaret looked at the brass key on the mantel. It caught the dying firelight and held it a small point of warmth in the gathering dark. Tomorrow they would go to court. Tomorrow they would face their children across a divide no lawyer could bridge. Tomorrow they would fight for what a dead man had trusted them to protect. But tonight the storm raged, and somewhere beneath their feet a vault full of beauty waited in silence, and the key that opened it sat on the mantel of a fireplace built by a man who had lost his wife and daughter, and spent the rest of his life proving that love doesn't end when the people you love are gone. It just changes shape. It becomes a cabin, a collection, a letter, a key, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it becomes a second chance you didn't know you needed until the moment it arrived. The Jefferson County Courthouse had stood since 1923. Its stone columns had weathered a century of Montana winters, and its hallways carried the echo of every dispute, every grief, every fragile attempt at justice this corner of the world had ever produced. Thomas and Margaret arrived at 8:30, half an hour before the hearing, because Thomas believed that people who show up early are people who take things seriously. And he wanted the court to know that these two old people in second-hand coats took this very seriously indeed. They hadn't slept. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the mountains scrubbed clean, and the sky so blue it looked like it had been painted by someone trying too hard. Margaret had spent the final dark hour before sunrise sitting on the edge of the bed holding Thomas's hand, neither of them speaking. There was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to rehearse. They either were who Elias believed them to be, or they weren't. The courtroom would decide, but Margaret already knew the answer. She'd known it since the night she found the vault, since the moment she'd read a dead man's handwriting, and understood that someone had been watching them quietly for decades and had seen something worth saving. Thomas had slipped the brass key into his shirt pocket that morning, the way he did every day now close to his chest. Margaret had noticed but said nothing. Some rituals don't need words. Mr. Finch and Patricia Ortega flanked them on the left. Robert Kane walked on the right. Between them, Thomas and Margaret moved through the courthouse hallway like two people walking into a headwind, leaning slightly forward, not fast, but not stopping. Rachel stood near the water fountain in a navy suit that fit her the way armor fits a soldier, precisely, deliberately, without warmth. Kyle paced near the windows. Emma sat on a bench with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on the floor, the posture of someone who'd already lost but hadn't been told yet. Michael was not there, true to his word. Gerald Thorne conferred with two associates near the courtroom doors. Three men in expensive suits holding briefcases thick with motions designed to make love sound like incompetence and theft sound like concern. Rachel saw them first. Her expression shifted. Worry replaced by something harder. Something that had learned to wear worry's face when cameras were present. She didn't approach, didn't speak, just watched with eyes that held no trace of the girl who'd once named clouds from her father's shoulders. Thomas's hand found Margaret's. She squeezed once. He squeezed back. At 8:45, Cedar Falls arrived. Dorothy Hartwell came first, wearing a coat Margaret had never seen, dark green, and pressed as if she'd saved it for occasions that mattered. Sheriff Whitaker followed in full uniform, his badge catching the hallway light. Then the owner of the general store, the mechanic. Hattie Colvin, walking slowly but with the bearing of a woman who'd spent 40 years commanding classrooms and wasn't about to be intimidated by a courthouse. Behind them, a dozen more people whose names Thomas and Margaret were still learning. People who'd left their shops and kitchens and morning routines to drive an hour to a courtroom because they believed that what happened inside it mattered beyond the two people it was about. They filled the benches on Thomas and Margaret's side, a quiet presence. No signs, no outbursts, just bodies in seats bearing witness. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors at 9 sharp. Judge Carolyn Winters entered through a side door. Black robe, crisp silver hair pulled back her expression, carrying the particular neutrality of someone who has heard every version of every human failing and has trained herself to wait for evidence before reacting. Be seated. She reviewed the docket. Case number 74-92, Brennan versus Brennan, petition for emergency guardianship. Her eyes moved to Gerald Thorne. Counselor, present your case. Thorne stood and smoothed his jacket the way a man smooths his jacket when he wants the room to notice how expensive it is. Your Honor, we are here because of serious concerns about the welfare of Thomas and Margaret Brennan, both in their 70s, living in an isolated location without family support. They've recently inherited a substantial estate valued at over $265 million, and their children believe they lack the capacity to manage such complex assets. Furthermore, we believe they are being unduly influenced by legal counsel with personal interest in the estate. Judge Winters raised an eyebrow. Evidence. Thorne produced documents, Thomas's stroke, their years of poverty, photographs of the cabin's remote location, the severed family contact, each piece presented with the smooth confidence of a man who builds cases the way magicians build tricks by making you look at the wrong hand. Robert Kane stood. His presence was different from Thorne's. No performance, no polish. Just the calm of someone holding better cards and knowing it. Your Honor, this isn't a case about protecting vulnerable people. It's about adult children who weren't named in a will and want access to money they have no right to. He handed a folder to the bailiff. Medical evaluations from 2 independent psychologists confirming full cognitive competency. Bank records showing the petitioners systematically drained their parents' savings. $137,000 taken under false pretenses, never repaid. Documentation that after the money was gone, these concerned children evicted their parents from the family home. The courtroom went still. Judge Winters read each page, and with each one, the line of her mouth grew thinner. Thorne's face reddened. Those were family loans, Your Honor. Informal arrangements during difficult times. Loans require repayment, Robert said. Not $1 was returned. Judge Winters set the papers down. I'd like to hear from the Brennans directly. Margaret's legs felt uncertain beneath her as she stood. But Thomas was beside her, and his hand was steady on hers. And together, they walked to the front of the courtroom, the way they'd walked through everything one step at a time. Mrs. Brennan, the judge said, her voice gentler now. Tell me what happened. Margaret took a breath. The room was very quiet. We worked our whole lives, both of us. 52 years of marriage, 4 children, a house we paid off by 60. When Thomas had his stroke, our daughter said we should move in with her. She said it was temporary. Margaret paused. She could feel Rachel's eyes but did not look. We sold our home, put the money aside, and then one by one they needed it. For bills, for bail, for surgery, for a business. We gave it because that's what parents do. We gave it because saying no to your own child feels like cutting off your own hand. Her voice steadied. And after the money was gone, so were they. Our daughter told us to find our own place. Our sons stopped calling. We lived in a 1-room apartment for 3 years. We applied for assistance and waited in plastic chairs and ate ramen noodles and tried not to think about the fact that the people we'd raised, the people we'd given everything to, had decided we weren't worth keeping. She looked at the judge. Then a man we barely knew left us his home. A man who'd watched us from a distance and saw something our own children never saw. He trusted us. And now the children who took everything want to take this too. Thomas spoke next, quieter, his voice rougher. Elias Brennan was my cousin. I met him twice. He left us his property because he believed we had integrity. He paused. Your Honor, my hands shake. They've shaken since the stroke, but my mind is clear. My wife's mind is clear. And the only people who've ever exploited our judgment are sitting on the other side of this courtroom. Judge Winters turned to Thorne. Counselor, do you have evidence of actual incompetence beyond a stroke that impaired motor function, and the choice to distance from family members who, by the documented record, financially abused them? Thorne opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Your Honor, the decision to sever ties with loving family members suggests a parent who's been exploited by those members. Robert finished. Judge Winters held up a hand. I've heard the arguments. She turned to her clerk. Please retrieve the sealed documents filed by the Brennan estate attorney. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Thorne looked confused. I'm not aware of any sealed documents. Judge Winters accepted an envelope from the clerk and broke the seal carefully. Inside were several pages and a letter. She read in silence for a long time, and as she read, something shifted in her expression. The professional neutrality giving way to something older, something that looked like recognition. She looked up. This is a letter from Elias James Brennan, written and notarized in 1994, with instructions that it be opened only if his heirs faced legal challenges from family members. She cleared her throat. I'll read portions into the record. The courtroom held its breath. To whatever court may be reviewing this matter. My name is Elias James Brennan. I write this in sound mind to explain my decisions. I have chosen to leave everything I own to my distant cousins Thomas and Margaret Brennan. Not because they are my closest relatives, but because they are good people in a world that often punishes goodness. Rachel's face went the color of ash. Kyle's jaw locked. I have watched Thomas and Margaret from a distance for many years. I attended their family gatherings. I saw their character tested and never broken. I also saw what their children became: entitled, ungrateful, willing to take without giving. I knew long before it happened that those children would bleed their parents dry. And I knew that when they did, Thomas and Margaret would need someone to believe in them. The judge continued. My estate is substantial. I leave all of it to Thomas and Margaret with one condition. If any family member contests this will or attempts to claim guardianship over my chosen heirs, this letter shall be made public, and said family members shall be permanently barred from any benefit whatsoever. She paused, letting the words settle. I have established a trust that cannot be broken by any legal challenge. Thomas and Margaret are the sole trustees. Their decisions are final. Judge Winters set the letter down and looked at Rachel, then Kyle, then Emma. Your cousin anticipated this 20 years in advance. She turned to Thorne. The medical evidence confirms competency. The financial record confirms abuse by your clients. The testator's own words confirm intent beyond any reasonable doubt. She picked up her gavel. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied. The petitioners are ordered to pay all legal fees incurred by Thomas and Margaret Brennan. A pause waited and deliberate. Any further harassment will result in restraining orders and criminal referral. The gavel came down, and the sound it made was not loud but final. The sound of a door closing on something that should have ended long before it reached this room. Cedar Falls erupted in quiet applause. Not the applause of a sporting event, but the applause of a congregation restrained, reverent, full. Dorothy pressed both hands over her mouth. Hattie nodded once the nod of a teacher whose student has finally passed the exam that mattered. Sheriff Whitaker stood at the back of the courtroom with his arms crossed and his expression saying everything his uniform prevented him from speaking aloud. Thomas pulled Margaret close. She pressed her face into his shoulder and felt something drain out of her body, something heavy and old that she had been carrying so long it had become part of her skeleton. She felt lighter. She felt 52 years lighter. Across the aisle, Rachel stood frozen. No remorse, no shame. Just the cold recalculation of someone scanning for angles in a room that no longer had any. Kyle's face was dark with something beyond anger, the particular humiliation of a man who has lost publicly and knows it. Emma simply looked lost, a woman standing in the wreckage of a family she'd helped destroy, and only now seeing the rubble clearly. They filed out without speaking. Thorne gathered his papers quickly, avoiding eyes. Their opportunity had collapsed. Their schemes entered into public record, their relationship with their parents reduced to a court transcript that would outlive all of them. Outside, under a sky so clean it hurt to look at the Cedar Falls contingent gathered around Thomas and Margaret. Dorothy hugged them both. Hattie pressed a handkerchief into Margaret's hand, embroidered with tiny blue flowers, the kind of handkerchief nobody makes anymore. Sheriff Whitaker shook Thomas's hand with both of his. Robert Kane pulled them aside. They could appeal. They won't win, but they could try. Legally, though, you're protected. The trust holds. The ruling is clear. He looked at them with something that had moved past professional respect into something more personal. You can finally build what you came here to build. 6 months later, the Elias Brennan Foundation for Elder Justice opened in a timber frame building adjacent to the cabin. Thomas had worked with the construction crew every day, his shaking hands driving nails and cutting boards alongside men half his age who'd stopped noticing the tremor after the first week, because the work got done regardless. Margaret ran the support programs, her nursing background, and her own story giving her a credibility no credential could match. They sold portions of the collection through private sales and careful auctions. Each piece went to collectors and museums that would preserve it. Each sale generated funds that went directly into the foundation. They kept only what they needed. The cabin remained home. The simple life remained the template. Dorothy became the foundation's historian. Sheriff Whitaker joined the board. Hattie volunteered 3 days a week, teaching art classes to survivors who'd forgotten they were allowed to create anything beautiful. The first person the foundation helped was a woman named Helen, 74, who arrived carrying everything she owned in 2 trash bags. Her daughter had taken power of attorney and sold her home. Helen had been sleeping in her car for 3 weeks. Margaret met her at the door. She didn't ask questions. She didn't fill out forms. She pulled Helen into her arms and held her the way you hold someone who has forgotten what it feels like to be held. "We've got you," she whispered. "You're safe now." 6 months later, Helen had her own tiny home on the foundation property. Her daughter was facing criminal charges, and Helen herself was volunteering at the front desk, greeting new arrivals with the same words Margaret had given her, passing them forward like a currency that gains value every time it changes hands. On the day Helen moved into her tiny home, Margaret placed something in her palm. The brass key, not the original that still sat on the cabin's mantel, but a copy cut at the hardware store in Cedar Falls, identical in weight and shape. The key to Helen's front door. Helen looked at it, looked at Margaret. "What's this?" Margaret closed Helen's fingers around the brass. "A second chance. That's all any of us really need." 2 years after the trial, Michael appeared at the cabin door on an autumn afternoon when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first bite of winter. He looked different, thinner, older, but his eyes held something new. Clarity, perhaps, or the particular steadiness of someone who has spent 2 years dismantling the person they were and isn't finished yet, but has made enough progress to stand in front of the people he hurt and not look away. He didn't make excuses. He told them about therapy, about cutting off his siblings, about sending money orders every month, the $20,000 repaid in installments of $300, no return address, no expectation. "I can't undo what I did," he said, and his voice broke the way ice breaks in spring, not cleanly but in jagged pieces that let the water through. "But I wanted you to know I see it now. What you built here, what you're doing with Elias's gift, it's everything I wasn't." Margaret reached across the kitchen table and took his hand. She didn't offer full forgiveness, Some wounds close but leave scars that ache when the weather changes, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. But she offered what she could. "You're here now," she said. "That's a start." Thomas nodded, slowly, not acceptance, not yet, but acknowledgement that the door was not locked even if it wasn't open. 5 years after the court hearing on a morning in October, when the mountains wore their first dusting of snow, like a congregation wearing white, 300 people gathered on the foundation grounds for the dedication of the Elias Brennan Memorial Garden. Paths wound through native wildflowers and serviceberry bushes. Benches carved from timber cleared from Elias's own land offered places to sit and remember. And at the center stood a stone monument, its surface carved with words from the final page of a leather journal, written underground by a man who had lost everything and spent 37 years proving that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. In a world of takers, remain givers. In a time of greed, maintain integrity. Build something that outlasts you. Margaret stepped to the podium. She was 78 now. Her hair had gone fully white. Her hands, spotted with age, gripped the edges of the lectern the way she'd once gripped the railing of the Greyhound bus, holding on because letting go was not an option. 5 years ago, my husband and I had nothing. We'd been betrayed by the people we loved most. We were living in poverty, forgotten and dismissed. Her voice carried across the gathered crowd, clear as the stream that ran through the western edge of the property. Then a man we barely knew gave us everything, not just money, not just property. She looked at Thomas standing beside her, his hair white now too, his hands still. But not because they'd stopped shaking, because he'd learned that steadiness isn't the absence of trembling, but the decision to keep holding on regardless. He gave us trust, and trust, it turns out, is the most valuable thing one person can give another. She gestured to the buildings behind her, the foundation center, the tiny homes, the clinic that had opened last year, the art studio where Hattie taught watercolors to women who'd arrived with nothing and were learning stroke by careful stroke to see themselves as people who could create something worth looking at. This is what a fortune looks like when it's used the way it was meant to be used. Not mansions, not yachts, not things that rust and rot and get fought over in courtrooms. This is legacy. This is love made practical. The crowd applauded. Thomas stood beside her, and together they cut the ribbon on the garden with scissors borrowed from Dorothy's library desk, because some things should be opened with tools that have a history of opening. Other things, books, minds, doors that people thought were closed forever. That evening, after the last visitor had left, and the caterers had packed away the folding chairs, and the mountains had turned purple in the falling light, Thomas and Margaret walked through the garden alone. Their steps were slower now, not uncertain, just unhurried. The steps of two people who had learned that arriving isn't the point, the walking is. They stopped at the stone monument. Thomas traced the carved letters with his fingertip, the same fingertip that had traced the carved oak leaf on the mantel, and found the hidden button that opened the floor and changed everything. "Do you think he knew?" Thomas asked. "When he left us everything. Do you think he knew we'd do this?" Margaret looked at the words in the stone, then at the cabin behind them, its windows glowing amber in the dusk, the way they'd glowed the first night they arrived, as if the house had been keeping a lamp lit for travelers who hadn't yet learned they were coming home. "I think he hoped," she said. "I think he trusted. And I think that trust was the real inheritance, not the paintings, not the gold. The belief that we were capable of something better than what had been done to us." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand. The brass key still sat on the mantel where it had sat every day since the first night. It no longer opened anything. The vault had been emptied, its contents dispersed to museums and auction houses and the foundation's endowment. The cabin door had a new lock, but the key remained, worn smooth by decades of hands. Elias's first, then Thomas's, then Margaret's, then Helen's copy, and the copies after that one for every person the foundation had given a new start. Dozens of brass keys now scattered across Montana and beyond, each one carried in a pocket or hung on a chain or set on a nightstand where it could catch the morning light and remind its owner that someone somewhere had once believed they were worth saving. Margaret picked up the photograph Dorothy had given them years ago. Young Elias standing beside the cabin with Ruth and Lillian. The three of them caught in a moment so ordinary. It was sacred, a man, a woman, a child, a house, a summer afternoon. Everything that mattered, everything that could be lost, everything that Elias had spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild, not for himself, but for people he would never meet, who would need it the way he had needed it and hadn't had it. She set the photograph back on the mantel beside the key. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing us when no one else did." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way it had moved through them for 100 years, and would move through them for 100 more, carrying the smell of snow and cedar, and the particular sweetness of mountain air at dusk. An owl called from somewhere deep in the forest, low and patient. The same call Margaret had heard the first night they arrived, as if the bird had been keeping watch all this time, and would keep watching long after the cabin was empty and the key had passed to hands not yet born. Thomas pulled her close. She leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his chest, the steady rhythm of his heart, the slight tremor in his arms that she'd stopped noticing years ago because it had become part of him. The way the grain is part of wood, not a flaw, but a record proof that the tree had weathered storms and was still standing. They sat together in the chairs by the fire. The same chairs they'd sat in on their first night, when they'd had nothing but warmth and shelter and each other, and had called it enough. They had more now. They had purpose and legacy, and the knowledge that 5,000 people in 10 years had walked through the foundation's doors and walked out carrying something they hadn't had when they arrived. Not money, not answers, just the quiet, stubborn belief that being forgotten by the people who should have loved you doesn't mean you're not worth remembering. The key caught the firelight one last time, and Margaret watched it glow the way she'd watched it glow that first night, small and brass and impossibly warm. Some keys open doors, some keys open vaults, but the rarest ones, the ones worn smooth by the most hands open. Something that has no lock and no hinge and no frame. The part of a person that has been closed so long they've forgotten it was ever open. Elias knew that. He'd spent 37 years carving that key. And Thomas and Margaret Brennan, who'd once sat in plastic chairs waiting for their number to be called, who'd once eaten ramen noodles in a room above a restaurant, and wondered if anyone in the world still knew their names, had spent the rest of their lives learning what it opened. Not a door, not a vault, a life worth living, a legacy worth leaving, a love worth giving away. If someone once opened a door for you when the rest of the world walked past, share this story with them tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe so that tomorrow evening we can sit together by the fire again.